Welcome back to our channel where the shadows come alive and nightmares become reality. Sit back, grab a blanket, and prepare to be terrified. The hospital was a place of both hope and despair. Every day people were brought there to be healed, but not everyone left the building alive. It was a place of endless corridors, sterile smells, and the constant hum of machines. But in the depths of the hospital, in the old abandoned wing, something sinister lurked. The hospital was dark, and the hallways were eerily quiet. There were no sounds of life, just the humming of machines and the occasional creaking of the floorboards. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. It was the dead of night, and the hospital was empty, except for one lone nurse on duty. Emily had been working at the hospital for years, and she had seen it all. She had seen the best and the worst of humanity, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. As she was sitting at the desk, filling out paperwork, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from down the hallway. She ignored it at first, thinking it was just the wind, but the tapping grew louder and more persistent. As the night wore on, Emily felt more and more uneasy. The hospital was supposed to be quiet at night, but she could hear strange noises coming from the old wing. It sounded like someone was moving around in there. Emily knew she should investigate, but she was afraid. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, she gathered her courage and decided to check it out. She walked down the long, dark hallway into the old wing, her footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something rotten. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the door to the old wing. She pushed it open slowly, and as soon as she stepped inside, she knew that she had made a terrible mistake. The old wing was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were stained with blood and rust, and the air was filled with the stench of death. What she saw made her blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the middle of the room, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light, and its skin was gray and mottled. It was a creature straight out of her worst nightmares. Emily tried to turn back, but it was too late. It had seen her, and it was coming for her. She could hear it shuffling behind her, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Emily started to run, but she knew that she couldn't outrun whatever was chasing her. As she turned a corner, she saw a door and ran towards it. She pushed it open and found herself in a small room with no windows and only one door. Emily knew that she was trapped. She could hear it getting closer, its breathing ragged and heavy. Emily looked around the room, desperate for a way out. That's when she saw it, a ventilation shaft in the ceiling. She jumped up and grabbed the edge, pulling herself up as fast as she could. She could hear the thing behind her, trying to grab her feet. Emily scrambled up into the shaft and started crawling away as fast as she could. The shaft was narrow and cramped, but Emily kept crawling, not daring to look back. She didn't know how far she had gone, but it felt like hours. Finally, she saw a light ahead and crawled toward it. As she emerged from the shaft, Emily found herself in a brightly lit room. She looked around, trying to figure out where she was. It looked like a laboratory, with strange machines and tubes filled with strange fluids. But as Emily looked closer, she realized that the machines weren't medical equipment. They were torture devices, designed to inflict pain and suffering on their victims. Emily backed away slowly, trying to find the door, but it was locked, and she was trapped once again. She could hear the thing behind her, its breathing getting louder and more labored. Emily turned around and saw the monster, with skin that was pale and sickly. Its eyes were sunken and dark, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Emily tried to run, but the monster grabbed her by the arm, its grip like a vice. Suddenly, the creature lunged toward her body, and she felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around her throat. She struggled to break free, but the creature was too strong. She could feel its cold breath on her face as it whispered in her ear. The nurse could not make out what the creature was saying, but she knew it was something evil. She closed her eyes, hoping it was all just a nightmare. But when she opened them, the creature was still there, staring at her with those glowing red eyes. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature tightened its grip on her throat, and she felt herself slipping away. Just when she thought it was all over, the creature released her, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The nurse lay on the ground, trembling with fear. She knew she had to get out of there, but her legs felt like jelly. She managed to crawl towards the door, and just as she was about to reach it, she heard another sound. It was a sound she recognized all too well. It was the sound of a gurney being wheeled down the hallway. She knew there was no one else in the hospital, so who was pushing the gurney? She turned around, and what she saw made her heart stop. On the gurney was a body that had been mutilated beyond recognition. Its limbs were twisted and broken, and its face was a mass of torn flesh and bone. Blood was seeping through the sheets, staining them red. Emily screamed, but no one came. The monster dragged her towards one of the machines, its purpose clear. Emily struggled and fought, but it was no use. The monster was too strong. It strapped her to the machine, her arms and legs immobilized. Emily could feel her heart racing, her breathing shallow. The machine whirred to life, and Emily screamed in agony as electricity coursed through her body. It felt like her skin was being peeled away, layer by layer. Emily could hear the monster laughing, its cruel laughter echoing in the room. But just as suddenly as it had started, the machine stopped. Emily's body went completely limp, and her mind began to race. She couldn't feel her heart beating anymore, and her breaths became shallow and sporadic. Her eyes felt heavy as she tried to make sense of what was happening. At first, Emily thought that she must be dreaming, but as she tried to move her arms and legs, she realized that she was completely paralyzed. She could feel the cold metal of the table beneath her, and the straps that held her down were tight against her skin. As she struggled against the restraints, a sense of panic began to wash over her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Emily's mind was spinning with questions, but one in particular stood out. Was she dead? She felt like she was floating, disconnected from her body. The room around her seemed to blur and fade, and the only thing she could focus on was the strange machine in front of her. It was the same machine that the monster had used to torture her, the one that had caused her so much pain. As the machine began to hum to life, Emily felt a jolt of electricity surge through her body. It was an intense, searing pain that made her want to scream, but she couldn't even open her mouth. As the torture continued, Emily's thoughts became hazy and disjointed. She could feel herself slipping away, her consciousness fading, and then suddenly, everything went black. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the hospital room. She was standing in the same room, but everything was different. The machines were gone, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of dust. As she looked around, Emily began to realize that something had changed. She couldn't feel her body anymore, and when she tried to move her arms and legs, nothing happened. She was weightless, and her thoughts were the only thing that kept her anchored. It was then that she knew for certain that she was dead. Her spirit had left her body behind, trapped in the hospital forever. Emily was a ghost, and she was trapped in the same room where she had been tortured and killed. The realization hit her hard, and she felt a deep sense of despair wash over her. She was alone, in the dark, with no way out. But as she looked around, she saw something that gave her hope. She saw other spirits, trapped in the laboratory, trapped in the hospital. They were the victims of the monster, the victims of the hospital. Emily joined them, a ghost among ghosts. Together they haunted the hospital, seeking revenge on the monster and all who had hurt them. They whispered in the ears of the living, warning them to stay away, to leave the hospital and never come back. And so the hospital remained abandoned, a dark and sinister place. The monster still lurked in the old wing, waiting for its next victim. But no one ever came, not after the whispers started, not after the rumors spread. The hospital remained a place of horror and death. The spirits of the victims still roamed the halls, seeking justice for the terrible things that had been done to them. And Emily, their newest member, was among them, her spirit trapped in the hospital forever. Years passed, and the hospital remained abandoned, a dark and foreboding place. The legend of the haunted hospital grew, and people began to tell stories about the monster that lived there, the one who tortured and killed its victims. But there were still those who didn't believe, those who thought it was just a story. And so, one night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the hospital, to see for themselves if the rumors were true. They crept through the empty corridors, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. They made their way to the old wing, where the monster was said to live. As they pushed open the door, they could hear strange noises coming from inside. It sounded like something was moving around, something big and heavy. The teenagers pressed on, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the cold, clammy air on their skin, and they could smell the stench of decay. Suddenly, one of them screamed. They had seen something horrible. It was the monster, the one they had heard about. It was coming for them. The teenagers ran, their feet pounding on the floor, but the monster was too fast, too strong. It grabbed one of them, dragging them back into the darkness. The others could hear their friends screaming, could hear the sound of bones breaking. They knew they had to do something, but they were paralyzed with fear. And then they heard another sound, a sound that chilled them to the bone. It was the sound of laughter, cruel and twisted. The teenagers knew then that they were not alone, that there were other spirits in the hospital, spirits who had been trapped there for years. They could feel the presence of the ghosts all around them and could hear their whispers in the dark. The monster was still there, still chasing them. But the teenagers knew they had a chance now, a chance to escape. They ran faster, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the monster getting closer and could feel its hot breath on their necks. But they didn't stop, didn't look back. They ran until they reached the exit, until burst out into the cool night air. The teenagers never went back to the hospital and never told anyone what they had seen. But the legend lived on, and people still talked about the haunted hospital, the one where the monster lived. And in the depths of the hospital, the spirits of the victims still roamed, seeking justice for the terrible things that had been done to them. And among them was Emily, the young nurse who had been trapped there so many years ago, her spirit still haunting the hospital, still seeking revenge. Charlotte had always been a thrill seeker. She loved exploring new places and discovering hidden gems that nobody else knew about. So when she saw the abandoned hut at the top of the hill, she knew she had to investigate. The sun was setting as Charlotte began her ascent up the hill. The sky was a deep shade of red, and the air was thick with the sounds of crickets and other night creatures. But Charlotte was undeterred. She had brought her flashlight and was ready for whatever lay ahead. As she climbed higher and higher, the abandoned hut loomed larger in her vision. It was an old, run-down building made of rotting wood and rusted metal. The windows were shattered, and the roof was caved in as if it had been abandoned for years. Charlotte had always been drawn to the supernatural. She loved the idea of ghosts and spirits, and was always on the lookout for signs of their existence. So when she saw the abandoned hut at the top of the hill, she knew she had to investigate. It was surrounded by a thick forest that whispered ominously in the wind. The hut itself was a small, rundown structure made of rotting wood and rusted metal. It had obviously been abandoned for years, and the signs of neglect were evident in every corner. The roof was caved in, with moss and vines growing up through the cracks. The windows were shattered, with shards of glass littering the ground around the hut. The wooden walls were covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, giving the impression that nobody had set foot inside in ages. As Charlotte approached the hut, she could see that the door was barely hanging on its hinges. It creaked and groaned in the wind as if warning her to stay away, but she couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. Inside the hut, the decay was even more apparent. The floor was littered with debris and trash, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of mold and mildew. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the sound of insects scurrying across the floor was deafening. Despite the ominous atmosphere, something was intriguing about the hut. It was as if it held secrets and mysteries that were waiting to be uncovered. And Charlotte was determined to discover what lay hidden within its walls, no matter the cost. But despite its dilapidated state, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the hut. There was a sense of foreboding in the air, and a feeling of dread crept up her spine. But still, she pressed on. As she got closer to the hut, Charlotte noticed a strange smell wafting from within. It was a musty, rotten smell, like something dead and decaying. Her stomach churned, but she pushed her fear aside and stepped inside. The inside of the hut was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in a thick layer of mold and mildew, and the floor was littered with debris and trash. And then, Charlotte saw it. In the corner of the room, there was a figure huddled in the darkness. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Its skin was pale and translucent. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, and its limbs were bent and twisted at unnatural angles. The figure turned to face Charlotte and let out a mournful cry, and then it vanished into thin air. Charlotte tried to run, but her path was blocked by more and more apparitions. They were the ghosts of the people who had lived in the hut, and they were angry. They shrieked and wailed, and tried to drag Charlotte down into the darkness with them. And as Charlotte's vision began to fade, she realized that her love of the supernatural had led her down a path she could never return from. She had stumbled upon something truly terrifying, and now she was trapped in a world of ghosts and spirits. She found herself in a world unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a world of shadows and whispers, of half-formed shapes and ghostly apparitions. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the sound of mournful cries echoed in the distance. The world Charlotte found herself in was a desolate, haunting place. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and where the spirits roamed freely. As she looked around, Charlotte saw that the world was shrouded in a thick mist, with only the occasional flicker of light piercing through the darkness. The ground beneath her feet was rough and uneven, with jagged rocks and twisted roots tripping her up at every turn. The sky overhead was a deep shade of black, with no stars or moon to light the way. Charlotte stumbled forward, her legs weak and unsteady. She felt as if she was walking through water, each step an effort. But still, she pressed on, driven by an unshakable desire to escape this world of spirits. But no matter how far she walked, she never seemed to get any closer to the exit. The spirits whispered and moaned, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. And then, something touched her shoulder. Charlotte turned and found herself face to face with a spirit. A scream lodged itself in her throat, but all she could do was stare numbly ahead. It was unlike any she had ever seen before. Its skin was as white as snow, and its eyes glowed like orbs in the darkness. Its fingers were long and thin, and its lips were curled into a cruel smile. The spirit reached out, and Charlotte felt its icy fingers wrap around her wrist. It pulled her closer, its laughter echoing through the darkness. Charlotte fought against them, struggling to break free from their grasp. But the spirits were too strong, and she was quickly overwhelmed. She screamed for help, but her cries went unheard. As the spirits closed in around her, Charlotte felt herself being lifted off the ground. She was weightless, as if she were floating on a cloud. The spirits carried her through veils of realms, their grip tightening with each passing moment. As they flew, Charlotte saw flashes of the spirits' lives. She saw the hut in its heyday when it was a lively home filled with laughter and love. But then she saw the darkness that had consumed them, and the evil that had driven them to their deaths. The spirits carried Charlotte to a clearing, where they set her down gently on the ground. They formed a circle around her, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. And then, they began to speak. Their voices were faint at first, but they grew louder and more insistent with each passing moment. They told Charlotte of their pain and suffering, of the evil that had taken hold of their lives and driven them to their deaths. As the spirits spoke, Charlotte felt a strange energy coursing through her body. It was as if the spirits were trying to merge with her, to take over her very being. At first, she resisted, but then she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. It was as if they were pulling her deeper into their world of spirits. And then, everything went dark. She opened her eyes to see the realm had changed. She was now someplace else, assuming it was still the spirit world. Charlotte did not give up on her quest to escape and trekked on. As she walked, Charlotte noticed that the landscape around her was constantly shifting and changing. Trees sprouted up from the ground, their twisted branches reaching out like grasping hands. Rivers appeared out of nowhere, their murky waters churning with unseen currents. And then there were the spirits. They were everywhere, their ghostly forms swaying and moaning as they floated through the mist. Some were human-shaped, while others were twisted and malformed, their faces twisted in pain and anguish. Charlotte tried to avoid them, but they seemed to be drawn to her, their pale, ghostly forms closing in on her from all sides. Their eyes were hollow and lifeless, and their fingers were cold as ice. As she walked deeper into the world of spirits, Charlotte saw that some entire cities and towns had been abandoned by the spirits. They were sprawling, ruined metropolises with crumbling buildings and twisted, rusted metal. The spirits had taken up residence in these abandoned places, their ghostly forms haunting the streets and alleyways. Charlotte could hear their moans and whispers echoing through the empty buildings, and she knew that she was never truly alone. Despite the haunting atmosphere, there was a strange beauty in the world of spirits. It was as if they had taken all the discarded remnants of the living world and woven them into something new and strange. The twisted, gnarled trees were beautiful in their own way, and the abandoned buildings were fascinating in their decay. Even the spirits themselves, with their pale, ghostly forms, were hauntingly beautiful. But as Charlotte walked deeper into the world of spirits, she realized that this beauty was a deception. There was something dark and dangerous lurking beneath the surface, something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. The spirits grew more aggressive, their ghostly forms reaching out to grab at her with increasing frequency. The world around her grew darker and more twisted, with twisted trees and jagged rocks sprouting up from the ground. Charlotte tried to find a way out, but it was as if the world of spirits was an endless maze. No matter which direction she turned, she found herself facing more spirits and more haunting landscapes. And as Charlotte was dragged deeper into the world of spirits, she realized that her curiosity had led her down a path she could never escape from. She was trapped in a world of shadows and whispers, a prisoner to the very spirits. Charlotte tried everything she could think of to escape from the spirits. She ran, she fought, and she even tried bargaining with them. But no matter what she did, they always seemed to find her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Charlotte grew weaker and more hopeless with each passing day. She felt as though she was slowly losing herself, being pulled deeper and deeper into the world of spirits. But then, something unexpected happened. One day, Charlotte stumbled upon an old, abandoned temple. It was a dilapidated building, with crumbling walls and a roof that had long since collapsed. But as Charlotte stepped inside, she felt a strange energy wash over her. It was as if the temple was a sanctuary, a place where the spirits couldn't follow. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the walls were lined with strange symbols and carvings. Charlotte collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and drained. But as she lay there, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time since she had entered the world of spirits, she felt safe. And then, she saw them. A group of spirits had followed her into the temple, their ghostly forms flickering in the darkness. But as they drew closer, they suddenly recoiled, as if they had been repelled by something. It was then that Charlotte realized what had happened. The temple was a place of sanctuary, a place where the spirits couldn't follow. She had found a way to escape. Charlotte stayed in the temple for days, recovering her strength and exploring its ancient halls, and when she was finally ready, she stepped back out into the world of spirits. But this time things were different. Charlotte had found a way to escape, and she wasn't going to let the spirits take her again. She had a newfound confidence and a sense of purpose that she had never felt before. She fought back against the spirits, using the power of the temple to repel them, and slowly but surely she began to make her way back to the world of the living. It was a difficult journey, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but Charlotte was determined, and she finally managed to escape from the world of spirits. When she emerged back into the world of living, she was a changed person. She had seen things that no one else could imagine, and had been to places that most people would never dream of. But most importantly, she had found a way to escape from the world of spirits, and that was something that no one could ever take away from her. Joey slowly climbed down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard strange noises coming from the basement, and he was determined to find out what was causing them. As he reached the bottom step, he saw a faint glow coming from under the door leading to the utility room. Taking a deep breath, Joey cautiously opened the door and stepped inside. The room was filled with shadows, and the only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Joey began to make out shapes and objects scattered around the room. Suddenly, he heard a creaking noise coming from behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one there. He shook his head and turned back to the room, but he felt like he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he could feel his skin prickling with fear. That's when he noticed something in the corner of the room. It was a figure, hunched over and shrouded in darkness. Joey couldn't make out any features, but he could feel the presence of something sinister emanating from the figure. It seemed to be watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. Joey tried to back away, but he felt something pulling him forward as if he were being drawn towards the figure. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. As he drew closer, he could see that the figure was not human. Its skin was cold and clammy, its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. Joey stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of boxes and falling to the ground. The figure began to move towards him, its limbs jerking and contorting in impossible ways. Joey scrambled to his feet and raced towards the door, but he could feel the figure's cold breath on the back of his neck. As he burst through the door and into the hallway, Joey slammed the door shut behind him. He leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, and tried to steady his shaking hands. As Joey tried to steady himself, he felt a sudden tight grip around his ankle. He looked down to see the monster's bony fingers wrapped around his foot, its eyes fixed on him. Joey tried to kick the creature off, but it was too strong, and he felt himself being dragged back into the room. In a sudden panic, Joey reached out and grabbed the nearest object he could find, a hammer lying on a nearby shelf. With all his strength, he swung the hammer at the creature's head, and he felt it connect with a sickening thud. The creature let out a screeching howl and released Joey's foot, stumbling backward into the darkness. Joey took his chance and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against the door, panting for breath and trembling with fear. But as the adrenaline began to subside, he felt a sharp pain in his ankle, and he realized that the creature had bitten him before he could escape. Joey knew that he needed medical attention, but he was too afraid to go to the hospital. He spent the next few days in his house, barricading himself in his room and trying to forget about the creature that haunted his basement. But the wound on his ankle began to fester, and he knew that he needed help. He eventually mustered the courage to go to the hospital, but when he arrived, he found that the wound had already become infected, and the doctors had to amputate his foot. He became sort of a hermit, never leaving his house, and he spent the rest of his days living in fear of the monster that had forever changed his life. After Joey returned home from the hospital, he became even more reclusive. He was terrified of going back into the basement, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the monster was still down there, waiting for him. As the days turned into weeks, Joey's fear turned into an obsession. He spent all his waking hours thinking about the creature that had bitten him, and he knew that he had to face it again. One night, Joey gathered all the tools and weapons he could find and made his way down to the basement. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he was determined to confront the creature and put an end to his fear once and for all. As he opened the door to the utility room, he saw the faint glow coming from under the door again. Joey slowly opened the door and stepped inside, clutching his weapons tightly. At first, the room was quiet, and Joey thought that the creature had left, but then he heard a low growling sound coming from the shadows. He turned towards the sound and saw the creature emerging from the darkness, its eyes fixed on him. Joey raised his weapon and charged toward the creature, but it was faster than he expected. It lunged towards him, its razor-sharp teeth bared, and Joey barely managed to dodge out of the way. The creature was relentless, its movements jerky and unnatural, but Joey was equally determined. Joey had never experienced fear so real. He swung his weapons with all his might, striking the creature again and again. But the creature seemed impervious to his attacks, and it continued to advance toward him. Finally, in a desperate move, Joey grabbed a nearby gasoline can and threw it at the creature. The can exploded on impact, engulfing the room in flames. Joey stumbled backward, his clothes singed and his face covered in soot. He pats himself to ensure he was unharmed and watched in horror as the creature writhed in agony, its body consumed by the flames. As the flames died down, Joey approached the charred remains of the creature, unsure if it was truly dead. But as he looked closer, he realized that the creature had shriveled itself into the body of an ape. At this point, Joey realized it was nothing more than a vessel, controlled by something far more sinister than Joey could have realized at that point. It was a real living creature, but not one of this world. It was a spirit, trapped inside the body of an animal, and it had been using the creature to terrorize the neighborhood. Joey felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the horror of what he had just faced. He had come face to face with an evil spirit that had been trapped on this earth for God knows how long, and he had just destroyed its only means of physical existence. He stood still and let reality wash over him. What would happen now? But as Joey turned to leave the room, he heard a faint whisper, and he stopped in his tracks. The whisper grew louder, and Joey could hear the voice of the spirit that he had just destroyed. It was a voice full of malice and hatred, and it spoke of revenge. The spirit promised to haunt Joey for the rest of his days, to torment him in his dreams, and to make him suffer for what he had done. Joey tried to run, but the voice grew louder and more insistent, and he could feel the presence of the spirit around him, pressing in on him from all sides. In a desperate move, Joey reached for the nearest object he could find, a candlestick on a nearby shelf. He held it up in front of him, hoping to ward off the spirit with the light. But as he did, he felt a sudden coldness in the air, and the candlestick was snuffed out in an instant. Joey was plunged into darkness, and he could feel the spirit closing in on him. He had never felt panic like this before. It was like walls were closing in around him. He tried to run, but his path was blocked, and he felt himself being pushed back toward the creature's charred remains. He tried to fight, but his arms were leaden and slow, and he could barely move. In the end, Joey could do nothing but watch as the spirit consumed him, body and soul. He was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, haunted by the malevolent spirit that he had unwittingly set free. As Joey's mind was consumed by the malevolent spirit, he felt his body being pulled apart, ripped apart at the seams. The pain was unbearable, and he screamed in agony as the spirit fed on his flesh and his soul. There was no one around to help him, and all he could do was wither until the pain passed. But then, after hours, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. Joey felt a sense of calm wash over him, and he realized that he was no longer alone. The spirit had taken him, body and soul, and he was now a part of it, a vessel for its hatred and malice. Joey tried to fight it, but he knew it was hopeless. He was trapped inside his own body, a prisoner of the malevolent spirit that had taken control of him. He could feel its power coursing through him, and he knew that he was powerless to resist. And so, Joey became a part of the spirit, a willing participant in its reign of terror. Together, they haunted the neighborhood, feeding on the fear and pain of the innocent, and spreading their darkness wherever they went. Years passed, and Joey's name was forgotten, lost to the sands of time. But the spirit lived on, a malevolent force that could never be destroyed. And Joey was a part of it, forever trapped in the darkness, a prisoner of his own fear and despair. Joey's body slowly began to decay, consumed by the malevolent spirit that had taken control of him. His eyes became dull and lifeless, and his skin took on a sickly gray hue. But he was still alive, still trapped inside his own body, a prisoner of the spirit that had taken control of him. The spirit continued to haunt the neighborhood, and its power grew stronger with each passing day. People whispered its name in fear, and parents warned their children not to venture out after dark, for fear of encountering the malevolent spirit that roamed the streets. And all the while, Joey remained trapped inside his own body, a silent witness to the horrors that the spirit wrought. He could see everything that was happening, but he was powerless to stop it. He was just a passenger in his own body, a vessel for the spirit's hatred and malice. And so, Joey watched as the spirit consumed everything in its path, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. He watched as the world around him descended into chaos and despair, and he knew that he was powerless to stop it. In the end, Joey realized that he was not just a victim of the malevolent spirit, but a willing participant in its reign of terror. He had been consumed by his own fear and despair, and had willingly given himself over to the spirit that had taken control of him. And so, Joey remained trapped inside his own body, a prisoner of his own fear and the malevolent spirit that had taken control of him. He was lost to the world, a forgotten victim of a darkness that could never be destroyed.